Afternoon adventurers, welcome. Here we are back with new spell changes to existing spells. They're not new, some of them are new. In the Player's Handbook 2024, which came out last September, of course, it's now 2025. Here we are, we did it. I don't know what this intro is. Back here with the C's, spells that start with the letter C. There are a lot of them, so let's dive right in. I won't be going over spells that have not changed in the new Player's Handbook, and I won't be going over spells that have very minor changes. Things like using an action now referring to using a magic action. That's all bleh. Let's dive right in with Call Lightning. I always love this spell. The cloud now appears within range, not necessarily directly above the caster. And WotC has removed language about the cloud not appearing and the spell failing if there isn't space for the cloud. So ostensibly, you can cast this no matter what now. Even if you're indoors, the cloud will just fill up the top of the room and you can lightning people in it. That's super cool. Calm Emotions has had language removed about creatures failing the save by choice, as that is now a general rule. It works the same as it always does, but now that is in the spellcasting. Actually, not even just spellcasting, just saving throws in general. You can always choose to fail saving throws, so that's not in the spell's description anymore. Chain Lightning is the same, but the material components have been changed to just 3 silver pins and nothing else. Charm Monster and Charm Person I'm going to lump together because they changed in the exact same way. Upcasting the spell now gives us additional targets, and they no longer have to be within 30 feet of each other. So that's just a nice quality of life improvement. Otherwise, spells work exactly the same as they always did. Chill Touch has changed in that it is now actually a touch. It has a range of touch, it is a melee spell attack. They also bumped the damage up to 1d10 necrotic damage, making it among the more powerful cantrips now. The spell does still prevent the target from healing until the end of the caster's next turn, but it no longer debuffs undead. I always like to have a melee spell on my spellcasters because any melee damage dealt can knock out a creature instead of killing it. So I used to keep Shocking Grasp on all my casters, but I may be taking Chill Touch instead now because it does more damage. Chromatic Orb has changed in a very cool way. Now it can jump to different targets. They seem to have mashed together Chromatic Orb and Chaos Bolt from Xanathar's Guide to Everything, and frankly, I'm okay with it. This spell absolutely rips and tears now. It is a tool of destruction against the forces of evil. And because upcasting the spell increases the damage it deals, it makes the spell all the more likely to jump to extra targets. Also, the amount of targets it can jump to is equal to the level of the spell. So upcasting this is actually huge. Plus, if we cast the spell at 7th level, we deal 9d8 damage, meaning there will guaranteed be a repeat, because the numbers only go 1 through 8. So it will always jump, and it will jump up to 7 times. The spell interacts in a very positive way with anything that allows us to reroll damage, Elemental Adept changing 1s into 2s, because that could also make the spell jump if there's another 2 on the dice already, and any effect that maximizes damage, like the Evocation Wizard's Overchannel or the Tempest Cleric's Channel Divinity Destructive Wrath. Making all of those d8s 8s makes the spell jump to another target, at least to the best of my understanding. Circle of Death has had its damage increased to 8d8 instead of 8d6 and scales at 2d8 per spell level above 6th. I will take a damage increase on an absolutely massive area of effect spell. Clairvoyance had a very minor change in that now switching between seeing through the orb and hearing through it is a bonus action instead of an action. That's the only change, otherwise functions exactly the same. Clone no longer requires a cubic inch of the target's flesh as a material component. Oh no. That was always sort of a funny part of starting up the spell. You got a little piece off of your friends. And the vessel for the clone no longer specifies it needs to accommodate a medium creature, which makes sense because you can cast clone on someone larger than medium. That was always the case. The new description of how big the vessel is now reflects that better. Cloud Kill now deals damage right when it appears. That seems to be a trend with these spells. It's also how it works in Baldur's Gate 3. I don't know if that influenced their decision, but that's how it works now. It does its initial burst and then deals damage when a creature enters or ends its turn within the cloud. Maximum of once a turn, of course. Cloud of Daggers has been changed positively in that it now deals damage right away and when a creature enters its space or ends its turn there. And we can also move it as a bonus action. We can move the cloud, which didn't used to be a thing. So it's better. Color Spray's material component no longer specifies 3 different colors of sand, it just says colorful sand. Don't have to worry about that as much, I guess. More importantly, it is now a Constitution saving throw for creatures within the cone instead of rolling a number of HP that it affects like it used to. Sleep has been changed the same way. We'll get to that when we get to the S spells, of course, but these two spells were unique in their method of delivering their effect, and that has gone away. It's simply a con save now. This is really better for the mid to late game, as these two spells barely affected anything past level like 4, so overall a good change, but less interesting. C'est la vie. Command now works on all creature types, not only humanoid. That part is huge. It also doesn't require a shared language anymore. As long as the creature can hear you at all, your command goes through. They've also removed language about unlisted commands making up your own effects, much like Bestow Curse in the last video. We can't just make stuff up and hope the DM agrees to it anymore, according to the spell, although that's always the case when you're playing D&D. You can always make stuff up, so the spell doesn't really need to say that anyway. Upcasting the spell does not require targets to be within 30 feet of each other anymore. That is the same as those charm spells from earlier, and it's just a good quality of life change. You don't have to count out those squares anymore. As long as they're within range, you can affect them. The duration is now 1 round instead of instantaneous, but this change is mostly semantic. The difference is the effect could be dispelled by Dispel Magic, if someone really wants to burn a 3rd level spell slot doing that. Commune's material component is now only incense, not the other items. Otherwise, it's unchanged. Commune with Nature has had a revision in the way the information that you can receive from it is written. It's more specific now. For example, planar portals and CR10 plus Celestials, Elementals, Fey Fiends, and Undead, instead of just powerful creatures of those types. It is nice to have some more guidelines on what exactly you get out of the spell, so that DMs don't have to work as hard making that up. Compelled Duel has gotten a buff in that instead of a creature getting a saving throw when they try to move more than 30 feet away from the caster, they now simply can't do it, period. Compelled Duel always felt like there was a bit of a disparity in how the spell is supposed to work and how the mechanics actually function. So putting more restriction on where the target can go, I think, does a good job of helping to bring it more in line with the flavor. As a DM, if a player casts Compelled Duel on one of my monsters, that monster is going to duel that character, because that's what the spell's supposed to do, but now the mechanics line up with that idea better. Confusion is positively changed in that now it specifies the target doesn't get bonus actions, not just reactions. So it only uses its action and only to do whatever the die roll tells it to. And here we get to the conjure spells. These all work so much differently than they used to. They no longer summon a bunch of animals or fey spirits or whoever and just go to town following your instructions. Now they spawn some kind of AoE. I'll touch on what each of those is. Conjure animals, first, is now concentration up to 10 minutes, down from 1 hour, of course, and summons a portable damage area of effect that also buffs the caster's strength saves while they're near it. Honestly, not a bad spell for rangers because it gets more damage out turn after turn, and they can move it without using their action or bonus action, which is great because rangers need both of those things. That said, we can no longer summon Wall of Horse, and that makes me sad. Conjure Barrage has gotten a buff, now deals 5d8 instead of 3d8. Love to see it. Rangers still get this at the same level. Wizards and sorcerers are getting Cone of Cold, which deals 8d8, so sad about that still, but what can you do, I guess? At least it's better than it was before. The damage of Conjure Barrage is now Force instead of Bludgeoning, Piercing, or Slashing as appropriate to the weapon, which is a good change because few things resist Force. I guess we'll see if that's still true when the Monster Manual comes out next month, but, you know, until then. Also, more importantly, it requires the material component of a ranged or melee weapon instead of a piece of ammunition or a weapon with the thrown property. Which means two things. One, we don't have to specifically pull out like a javelin or a dagger or whatever just to cast the spell. And two, we can cast the spell with our weapon, whatever it is, and a shield or another weapon, whatever we have our hands full with. We can use the same hand to manipulate the material component that we use for somatic components. So even if our hands are full, if one of those hands has a weapon in it, we can cast the spell. Huge for rangers with shields and dual wielders. Conjure Celestial has changed in that it is now an action to cast instead of a minute. The duration is concentration up to 10 minutes, much like Conjure Animals. and now it creates a cylinder that is 10 feet wide and 10 feet radius and 40 feet tall, instead of conjuring a unicorn or a coatl. Those were pretty much the two options. Or a Hollyphant. That was also a thing. When we cast the spell, when we move the cylinder into a creature's space, and when a creature moves into the space or ends its turn there, we can either heal that creature for 4d12 plus spellcasting ability modifier, or damage the creature with a dexterity saving throw for 6d12 radiant damage. As a 7th level spell, these numbers might not sound the highest, but considering we can damage our enemies and heal our allies with the same spell, and it lasts 10 minutes, this is actually huge. The spell also allows us to heal our allies between fights. It lasts for 10 minutes, and every time a creature enters it or ends their turn there, they get healed. Period. There's no limit on how many times that can happen, so a ton of healing for 4d12 plus spellcasting ability modifier every single time is massive. I'm making a video on this spell specifically right now because it is the strongest healing spell in the game at this point. Period. I don't know why more people aren't talking about this. Talking thousands of points of healing over the course of 10 minutes. It's nuts. But moving on from that, Conjure Elemental is also an action to cast and also lasts up to 10 minutes, requiring concentration. Its range is now 60 feet, and the spell no longer has a material component at all. The spell conjures a semi-passive spirit, kind of reminds me of Guardian of Faith, that damages nearby creatures and restrains them one at a time. It can only damage and hold on to one creature, so its use may be more limited than something like a watery sphere or an entangle as far as restraining enemies goes, but it also lasts for 10 minutes. We can move it around, keep it with us. Maybe it'll be useful, I don't know. I gotta see it in play before I can really judge it. Similarly, Conjure Fey is now a range of 60 feet, an action to cast, no material component, and concentration up to 10 minutes. It now summons a medium-sized spirit that teleports around and attacks creatures when we use a bonus action to command it to do so, much like Spiritual Weapon. But druids don't get Spiritual Weapon, and even though Spiritual Weapon technically deals a little bit more damage when cast at spell level 6, the Fey can teleport. It teleports farther, it goes 30 feet per turn instead of 20 feet like Spiritual Weapon, and it scales at 2d12 per spell level, so if we upcast at all, even just with a 7th level slot, now it's out-damaging Spiritual Weapon. I doubt I even need to touch on Conjure Minor Elementals, as it earned its infamy instantly, with how much damage it can add to attacks. It's an action to cast, has a range of self, lasts 10 minutes requiring concentration. You'll see the running theme with these conjure spells. Y'all already know it's like a supercharged Spirit Shroud. It adds 2d8 damage to each attack made against creatures within 15 feet of the caster, and that goes up by 2d8 per spell level. It's absolutely ridiculous. I don't even cast it anymore. I did like once or twice just to have some fun, but my god, is it just busted. It also makes the ground difficult terrain within 15 feet, so there's that too. That's really not why people cast it though. Conjure Volley, much like Conjure Barrage, now requires just a ranged or melee weapon in our hands, which means we can cast it when our hands are full as long as one of those things is a weapon. Its damage is the same as it always was, but it now allows us to choose targets within its radius, which is a massive 40 feet. So the spell could actually be really good now for clearing out the mooks from a big fight. Anytime you're outnumbered, just drop 8d8 damage on them. The damage is now force as well, just like Conjure Barrage, instead of bludgeoning, piercing, or slashing. Contact Other Plane, instead of making the caster insane if they fail the saving throw and listing what those effects do, now simply says that the caster is incapacitated and cannot speak until they finish a long rest. It can still be undone with a greater restoration. Contagion, much like most of the spells and effects in the 2024 version of the game, no longer refers to disease per se, and now is simply a magical contagion. It allows a Constitution saving throw instead of the caster making a spell attack roll, and inflicts the poisoned condition for its duration. And while poisoned, the target now has disadvantage on saving throws with one ability score that the caster chooses when the spell is cast. Failing 3 subsequent saving throws makes the spell last for 7 days, just as it used to before, and a creature makes a Constitution saving throw if any effect would attempt to cure the poison, things like Lesser Restoration and Lay on Hands. If they fail the Constitution saving throw, the poison is not cured, so it's a bit more resilient of a poison than usual, but creatures who are immune to poison, you're kind of out of luck on this one. The spell was always kind of in a weird place because if you're actively working against and fighting a creature, it's probably not going to live 7 days anyway. But now it's just kind of a weaker version of itself. I don't know. Control water has changed a bit, specifically the whirlpool effect now deals damage at the end of a creature's turn instead of the start, and now specifies that it requires an action to attempt to break free from the whirlpool. It was ambiguous before whether that required an action or just movement, so now it's very specific. Cordon of Arrows now has a range of touch, and the arrows are planted in the caster's space rather than within 5 feet. I don't know if that's really going to change much about the spell. Its damage is also increased from 1d6 to 2d4, which is a pretty minor increase, but we'll take it. Counterspell. This one has changed quite a bit in that it now allows a Constitution saving throw made by the target and doesn't use an ability check by the caster to see if a spell is countered. It also does not automatically counter spells of 3rd level and lower or higher when upcast. In fact, it doesn't gain any benefit from being upcast now. It simply is what it is. Some creatures have pretty bad Constitution saving throws, so this will always be good against them. Some have really good Constitution saving throws. Some have legendary resistance, which I actually kind of like. It's always a bit anticlimactic when a Sararak or Zastam or Vecna casts a big ol' spell and just gets counterspelled by a 3rd level spell slot and isn't allowed to do anything on their turn. So now they can use legendary resistance to succeed on the saving throw, if they even failed it in the first place, and they guaranteed get to cast their big cool stuff. I think that's pretty good, personally. It also means that players have a chance to cast spells when they're up against counterspellers. Even if they're casting something low level, there's still a chance that it can get through. Especially true for sorcerers and artificers and their multi-classes, and anyone who has the Resilient Constitution feat. They will now have a harder time getting counterspell, which is just kind of gravy. It's nice. I played a high-level paladin in an adventure not too long ago, and my bonus to Constitution saving throws was so high that I just couldn't be counterspelled. Granted, I was also a paladin, so I wasn't casting that many spells, but still, it was nice. If countered, a spell does not cost a spell slot if the caster was using one, so that's going to affect players more than enemies at this point, it seems, because creatures in the monster manual seem like they're going to have limited uses per day instead of spell slots. So take that as you will. And the reaction's timing now specifies when the caster sees another creature casting a spell with verbal, somatic, or material components. That part's important because it was a bit ambiguous whether material components counted before, whether any components counted before technically, and now makes it very clear that if those spells have those components, so they're not being cast psionically or some such, they can be countered. Spells cast from magic items, spells cast with the subtle spell metamagic, spells cast by the Great Old One Warlock if they're enchantment or I believe it's illusion, do not require components. Some of them might still have material components, but those spells become uncounterspellable. Moving on from that one, Create Food and Water works the same as it always did, but has head language removed, referring to the amount of creatures that it can sustain, presumably because the rules for how much food and water a creature needs are in the player's handbook, so they didn't really need to write it in the spell to begin with. In a nutshell, the spell sustains up to 30 medium creatures. Large creatures cost more, tiny creatures cost less. Huge and gargantuan, of course, cost a lot more. Create Undead has changed in many of the same ways that Animate Dead changed, in that if we don't command our undead to do anything in particular, they now take the dodge action specifically. They've also tweaked the material component, so now it's only a stone of black onyx worth 150 gold pieces per corpse that we're resurrecting, instead of having a big list of stones and grave dirt and brackish water. It's only the stones now, so that's nice, I guess. And last, Cure Wounds has had a big old glow up in that it is now 2d8 healing plus our spellcasting ability modifier instead of 1d8. And when upcast, it gains another 2d8 per spell level. Massive, massive bonus for anyone trying to be a healer in this game. Healing has famously always been a matter of that person's down on the ground. I'm gonna give them 2 points of healing so they can get back in the fight until they get hit again. Which I never liked. So I'm glad that healing has become a more prevalent thing with these revisions. So I'm glad it's becoming more viable to actually heal our teammates and not just bounce them off the ground when they get to 0. That's a plus, I think. And that is finally all of the spells that start with C that have changed in the new PHB. We did it. We're done. We got there. That's all I have to say on that matter. I will see you in the next one. Thank you, those of you who are liking and subscribing, commenting down below. Comment your favorite C spell. I don't know. And I'll see you in the next one. Happy adventuring.